Good afternoon, and welcome to this third lecture of CVSP 202. CVSP core courses are designed to provide an interdisciplinary engagement with ideas that have shaped human existence across different periods and cultures through the reading of what we call great books or classics. Now, the selection and ordering of these texts is obviously not neutral. It is already a way of telling a particular story. Therefore, it should always be open to interpretation and even contestation. Why this text and not another? Why at this point in the semester and not another? I'm sure you have thought about such questions and perhaps even addressed them in your sections. Now, my name is Dalia Jubara. I am an assistant professor in the Civilization Studies program, but by training, I'm what we call an intellectual historian, meaning I'm interested in the history of ideas, the history of thought over time, with a specialization in Islamic thought and Islamic history. So I'm especially interested in these questions of canon formation, how we put together a cluster of texts to kind of tell a story, right? Why and how historians decide that such a theme or author is important or representative of the time and place is precisely what I research and I write about. And I always begin with the premise that history is a dialogue between the past and the present. A specific historical narrative tells a story about the past, that is true, but it also says something about the present. In that sense, it is important to stress that what I will be presenting to you today is only one historical interpretation among many others. And I hope that with your section leaders, you will explore these other possibilities and compare them to mine and reflect on them and challenge them and so on and so forth. So, let us take the case of the readings for CVSP 202. So far, you began with antiquity and philosophy, represented by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, as a type of philosophical background to monotheism. Then you moved to early Christianity, embodied by St. Augustine. And now you have arrived at this week's readings, something on your syllabus that is called classical Islamic thought. And it features Ikhwan Safa and Ghazali. This selection of texts and themes is obviously already full of meaning, as I've tried to say. To begin with, it tries to make connections between these texts. The terms themselves that are used are full of meaning too. The idea of classical Islamic thought is usually meant to refer to a certain period, broadly speaking, the 9th to the 10th centuries of the Common Era, after Christ. This period is often referred to as a golden age, al-Asr al-Dhahabi of Islam, a time when the religion's essential features and greatest contributions to human civilization were said to have been made. After this period, Islamic thought and civilization, it is argued, entered into a long period of decline, or inhitat, until the more recent efforts at European modernization that begin in the colonial period in the late 19th century. This paradigm, this idea of a Asr Dhahabi followed by centuries of decline, is deeply problematic, and I would like to begin today from a very different point of departure. Rather than having to define, Rather than having to define what's classical about the thought of Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali, I would like us to think of them instead as classics of Islamic thought, forcing us, in other words, to reflect on how and why they speak to us today. For what else is a classic other than a connecting thread between the past, however distant and different it might appear, and the present, however joyful or bleak? My main question to you is, do we read Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali simply as representatives of 10th century Abbasid Islamic history, or can reading them still resonate with us today? Can we find something stimulating and interesting in these texts today, where we are now, Beirut, 2018? In order to help us with this problem, I want to introduce you to two important ideas that will frame the rest of my lecture: late antiquity and the idea of Islam as a tradition. These ideas are quite difficult, they're complex, so please bear with me. I'm going to try and sketch them out very quickly, and if you have any questions, just throw your hands up and don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so late antiquity. Now, the first question we're faced with when studying a text is to identify its context, the time, the place, the cultural world in which it was written. In our case here, this begins inevitably with the revelation of the Quran. As you all know, Islam first arose in a narrow stretch of the Hijaz, the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but it expanded with lightning speed into other Middle Eastern regions and beyond, as you can see from the map. Now, two broad approaches to the history of early Islam have been dominant in the academy. One view sees Islam as a specifically Arabian religion, and the other argues that, in fact, Islam was so altered and influenced by its contact with other cultures, the Byzantines, the Persians, etc., that the Islam of the later dynasties, the earlier dynasties, mind you, the Abbasids and the Umayyads, actually bears very little relation to its original native land, the Arabian Peninsula. These positions appear to be opposites, but they share something crucial in common. They both rely on the idea that Arabia is marginal and isolated from its surroundings. By contrast, more recent studies insist that the Arabian Peninsula was in fact part and parcel of that late antique world that stretched over the entire domains once unified by Alexander the Great, whom you may have already met as Aristotle's famous student. A large geographical area crisscrossed by long-standing and wide-ranging networks and exchanges. In other words, we are not dealing here with some startling, unexplainable explosion from the dark deserts of Arabia of a nomadic people who are armed with nothing but the sword and the word of a very fierce god. That is not what we're dealing with here. In fact, we're dealing with a space that was culturally and linguistically polyglot, that was connected for centuries by trade routes, pilgrimage routes, imperial expansion and contraction. The world of late antique Arabia, in other words, was a space where ancient thought and religions competed and coalesced with monotheistic traditions of various sorts. In fact, there used to be, Allah yarhamu, a history professor here at AUB, the very famous Kamal Salib, who postulated that the Bible itself may have come from Arabia. Pretty controversial claim that he made, but an interesting one, and it gives us a sense of exactly how lively and how lived this space that we now think of as Arabia was. But without going into such a big contention, think a little bit about the story of the Kaaba. Do you all know what the Kaaba is? Right? The holy house of Islam in Mecca, yeah? The Kaaba was built not long before the Islamic revelation, supposedly by a Greek, an Egyptian, and an Ethiopian carpenter. Now, the simple fact that we can imagine a Greek, Egyptian, or Ethiopian carpenter in Mecca in the 7th century already testifies to how open this space was to the rest of the outside world. Okay, but it is important to think of this notion of late antiquity not just as a space of lived interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, involving political, social, economic, and cultural relations. Crucially, it is also a space where ideas, concepts, words, ideologies, stories, and memories also flowed with ease. In this sense, late antiquity is not just a chronological epoch, a time period, nor is it purely a geographical space. It is an epistemic space. Now, what I mean by that is that it is a space where knowledge-making, it is a space, I'm jumping ahead. It is a space of knowledge-making that shared common parameters regarding the conditions that make truth claims possible. In other words, when we claim something to be a form of knowledge or a form of truth, right, it is based on a set of conditions. Those conditions are epistemic, meaning they adhere to how we can test the validity of a knowledge, any knowledge system, but they're also institutional, they're cultural, what books are you reading, who's teaching you, etc. In other words, there's a whole universe that gets involved in knowledge making, not just the pure content of knowledge. Does that make sense? Okay. It is in this multicultural and multifaceted universe that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in 570 AD. And in due course, he would oversee the founding of yet a new tradition after beginning to receive revelation in his 40th year. Indeed, the Quran itself is perhaps the greatest single testimony to this diverse world of late antique Arabia, insofar as it consciously formulates itself as a continuation of an older universal message that was conveyed through a long series of prophets that reached their culmination with the Prophet Muhammad as Khatim al-Anbiya. And it is in both its language and its subject matter a text that is constantly in dialogue with its context. Moreover, in the course of the following centuries, after the death of Muhammad, a dedicated effort would be launched to make accessible in Arabic as much as possible from the intellectual production of the older traditions of thought. This is often described as simply the translation movement, and during this period, thousands of foundational scholarly texts were rendered into Arabic. Mostly they were being translated from Greek, but also from Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and other language, especially in Baghdad. It is the cumulative effect of these developments that forms the intellectual landscape within which our authors wrote their texts. But the main point to keep in mind concerning this translation movement is that however monumentally important it was, and indeed it was monumentally important, it built upon already existing trends of cultural, religious, and linguistic intermingling, including those in pre-Islamic Arabia. So, to sum up our first crucial point then, Islam is not some bizarre ideology that jumped out of an empty desert and that had to deal suddenly with the higher cultures of the late antique world. It was part and parcel of that world from the very start. Okay, point 2. Islam as a tradition. Understanding the emergence of Islam as belonging to this world of late antiquity requires us to appreciate deep time and broad space. The very idea of late antiquity, therefore, is an invitation to think about the shared commonalities of cultures, texts, and traditions. And this is one way, perhaps, that these texts can speak to us today. They ask us to think beyond the all-too-common clash of civilizations. However, we know also that Jews are not the same as Christians, and Christians are not the same as pagans, and pagans are certainly not the same as Muslims. So, it is equally important to recognize and explain the differences involved between and indeed within different traditions. Muhammad's project articulated itself as a revolution. It was cut off in many ways from the past out of which it emerged. That past was now called al-Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance. A very practical example of this break from the past would be the introduction of a whole new calendar, the Hijri calendar, the first year of which begins with the emigration of the Prophet and his small community of followers from Mecca to a neighboring town called Yathrib, which will soon simply come to be known as Al-Medina, or Al-Medina al-Munawwara. The new calendar marked the founding of the new Islamic community led by the Prophet Muhammad, obviously, but what it also did was to mark that community apart from those that existed before. So, simply folding Islam uncritically into some all-inclusive, to use a lay term, group hug notion, right, won't do. It can't work. It would both deny the originality of the new teachings, and it would prove unfaithful to the historical sources and the actors involved. The challenge, then, is to find a way to make sense of both propositions, the idea of continuity and the idea of a break or change from the past, okay? To juxtapose them, in other words, by taking seriously both the continuity and coherence of late antiquity as a shared epistemic space of knowledge-making, but also the radical break from the past that is involved in the affirmation of any new tradition. And this is where thinking through the notion of Islam as a tradition seems important to me. By tradition, I do not mean the common understanding of the word as that which is old and unchanging as opposed to something which is modern, dynamic, and new. Rather, I mean by tradition an arena that sustains in ways that are both conscious and unconscious a particular mode of life, a mode of thought, a particular way of being and a way of thinking that are continually in dialogue with the founding texts of the tradition. In the case of Islam, the founding texts are first and foremost the Quran. The revelation is the eternal word of God that predates time and space, but that was consecutively revealed since the dawn of time, and the Sunnah, the deeds and sayings of the Prophet that were transmitted to the community as a central authority on how to live a good Muslim life. These two elements form the linchpin of Islamic tradition across the centuries, and they remain central to it to this day. What is crucial about tradition in this sense is that it is not opposed to reason. It is rather the very condition that makes rational thinking possible. In other words, tradition is not fixed and static. Debate and change are integral to all traditions. This is why questions relating to whether this or that is halal or haram or makruh are constantly negotiated in Islamic settings. From the simplest questions, such as, is smoking tobacco acceptable? Is wearing jeans okay? To the most serious and the most profound, is free market economics a good thing? What should our relationship be to the environment? What is the best way to reach the truth of things? And this, again, is another way that you can think about these texts as speaking to us, demonstrating beyond a shadow of a doubt that tradition and reason are not contradictory, so that the world can simply not be carved up into rational, secular thinking types and religious unthinking types on the other hand. And it's precisely this that allows a certain intellectual unity and a universality of thought from Plato and before to Muhammad and beyond, to stand in balance with a firm affirmation of the particular singularity of Islam and the preoccupation with forging a new ummah or a new community, defining who's in and who's out. What are the aims of this new community? What are its forms of being, its forms of knowing, of acting, of making, of building? All things that we can now begin to think of as Islamic, quote unquote. This balance between the old and the new has preoccupied Muslim thinkers in various ways from the very start. And it is this epistemic challenge that characterizes Muhammad's prophetic mission itself. But it would become even more acute following his death, a foundational moment in the tradition, as the new ummah had to fend for itself without the direct presence of prophetic authority, and would soon extend further from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, a huge geographical expanse of enormous cultural diversity with which the new tradition had to now engage. Think about this a little bit. The same founding texts, the Quran and the Sunnah, will mean something both quite similar and yet distinctly different in, say, Senegal than they would in somewhere like Indonesia, okay? There's almost from the start different positions on this fundamental question: how do I reconcile the old with the new? These are often framed with broad labels such as rationalists, those who appeal above all to human reason; traditionalists, those who assert the primacy of transmitted tradition; legalists, those who adopt a legal interpretation of scripture; and mystics, those who emphasize a more spiritual mode of religious life. These labels are both helpful and problematic. And again, you may wish to discuss them more fully in your sections. For us here, what is important to highlight once more is the common fundamental question that undergirds them collectively. How is knowledge, including pre-Islamic and non-Islamic knowledge, grounded in tradition? So, to end this section on tradition in late antiquity, we might pose the following question: how does one justify and legitimize knowledge as one perceives it in its immediacy, i.e. how you apprehend it, right? But also as you receive it from the past. In other words, to give a very basic example, right? Your mom says, that is cat, okay? That is knowledge that you're receiving through tradition. It's been passed down to you, okay? Or you're apprehending, you're seeing cat and trying to understand cat in and of itself, okay? To put it another way, what is the relationship between al-manqul, that which is transmitted over time, and al-mahqul, that which you reach through your aql or through your reasoning? Okay? And I hesitate deliberately to define ma'qul as rational, because there's nothing irrational about transmitted knowledge. Transmitted knowledge is just as rational as what we would call al-ma'qul. Okay. The key question here, to put it more simply, how do I know that what I know is true? How can I arrive at certainty in knowing? And this is what I mean by epistemic certainty. Sorry, I'm losing my space here. Okay. These are fundamental questions of human existence, and it is because the texts you are reading this week deal with these questions that they're able to stimulate us so many centuries later. So in what remains of this lecture, I'm going to try and turn to the text, try and suggest a way that we can read them to begin carving from them a notion of an Islamic tradition, an understanding of how the past and the present speak to each other, so on and so forth. Okay. Ikhwan al-Safa. Little is known about the group of anonymous Muslim intellectuals who call themselves Ikhwan al-Safa wa Kullan al-Wafa wa Ahli al-Hamd wa Abna al-Majd, the brethren of purity, the loyal friends, the people of praise, and the sons of glory. Their importance stems from the fact that they collectively authored an important work, an encyclopedia of sorts, in which they attempted to gather and classify all knowledge available during their time in the form of 52 epistles or tracts known simply as the Rasail. Sectioned into 4 broad subject areas, the epistles cover a wide range of topics and disciplines, from arithmetic, geometry, logic, physics, astronomy, magic, and natural philosophy, to geography, music, metaphysics, ethics, theology, politics, pedagogy, belles lettres, and mysticism. Operating as a sort of secret society, the members of this group met regularly to partake in intellectual pursuits and rituals that drew from a wide array of cultures, all in the spirit of brotherhood and mutual aid between a socially diverse collective of seekers of knowledge who saw themselves as united in a spiritual city, a mystical utopia which they called Dawlat al-Khair, the abode of the good. Beyond this, the Ikhwan remain very much an enigma, so that practically everything that we know about them is a matter of scholarly debate. This begins with their actual identities, which they deliberately kept secret, and extends to their intellectual, political, sectarian, and creedal affiliations. The speculation even involves such simple facts as the period and place in which they were writing, although there is now some consensus that the brethren were based in the cities of Basra and Baghdad in modern-day Iraq and were active sometime around the last quarter of the 10th century. By contrast, we know a great deal more about our second author. Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali is one of the most celebrated scholars of Islam. World famous already in his time, his imprint on the development of Islamic thought earned him the honorific title of Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, and the renewer, the mujaddid of the faith. This places al-Ghazali among some of the greatest celebrities in Islam's historic hall of fame. And it ensures his continuing relevance, the continuing relevance of his thought and writings to the present by both his supporters and his detractors alike. Al-Ghazali was born into a family of modest means in the village of Ghazali on the outskirts of Tus in today's northeastern Iran in 1058. Orphaned at a young age, he received an elementary education in Tus before traveling to Jurjan and then Nishapur, where he undertook an extensive program of study under the city's most eminent ulama. Within a few years, Al-Ghazali had already begun to make a name for himself as a leading scholar, a prolific writer, and an impressive teacher. This earned him the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks. The Seljuks were a dynasty that controlled vast territories under the nominal sovereignty of the Abbasids. Nizam al-Mulk invited al-Ghazali to teach in the newly founded educational college in Baghdad, al-Madrasa al-Nizamiyya, which would have been one of the most prestigious institutes of learning at that time, okay? Much like our very own AUB. Reaching the summit of his professional career, Al-Ghazali suddenly undergoes a severe crisis, and he decides to retreat from teaching and public life. He reflects on the reasons for this withdrawal in the text that you're reading, and he weaves together a personal or spiritual explanation with an intellectual one. Now, if you're beginning to see parallels here between Ghazali and St. Augustine, then you're paying attention, because both these figures would come to represent a particular strand of philosophical thought broadly identified as a form of medieval skepticism, which again, I'm sure you will discuss in your classes. Al-Ghazali abandons his position and family and embarks on a long period, over a decade, of ascetic wanderings, which took him from Baghdad, and you can see them on this map here, took him from Baghdad to Syria, to Palestine and the Hijaz, and finally back to Tus. It was during this period that he authored his most famous work, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, in which he reflected on the relationship between law, theology, mysticism, and their related disciplines, and which, along with his earlier works on jurisprudence, Islamic legal theory, and his two main philosophical contributions, Maqasid al-Falasifa, in which he begins to outline the Neoplatonist ideas of the Muslim philosophers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he sets about debunking many of their main ideas, secured his enduring legacy as both a highly revered and a highly controversial figure. The text before you, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, or The Deliverance from Error, was written a few years before his death in 1111 AD. He is reportedly buried in what you see here, the Haruniya complex in Tus, and apparently his mausoleum still stands there today, although there's some debate about whether it's Al-Ghazali. Okay, so hailing from seemingly different backgrounds, experiences, and intellectual periods and milieus, separated by shifting geographical locations and at least a century of time, and a very eventful century at that, our authors appear to represent two separate strands of classical Islamic thought. One is syncretically grounded in philosophical ideas, Gnostic spirituality. It freely espouses an ecumenical liberal spirit of tolerance. It blends monotheism and non-monotheistic cultures and beliefs. And the other appears to be characterized by an ambivalence towards philosophy, more concerned with maintaining a very orthodox view of things that wants to accommodate both mystical and legal approaches. The variances are also clear in the two texts that you are reading, which belong to two very different genres of writing. The first is a literary narrative, the Ikhwan's text, is a literary narrative in the form of a well-known satirical fable aimed at delivering an ethical, ecological message. The second is a self-conscious intellectual tract that mixes biological. None of you picked up on that, right? Autobiographical, that mixes autobiographical references. All of these differences concerning the texts, the context of the authors, the form, the content, the genesis, the reception of their ideas, etc., are all very important, and I suspect you will discuss them at some length in your individual sections. Here, I'd like to suggest to you, keeping in mind what I've already said about change and continuity in the making of Islamic tradition, that these two texts ultimately share a fundamental unity as knowledge-making projects. In the time left, I will highlight a few details that point in that direction, and then I'll conclude with a few implications. Okay, the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. In Epistle 22 of the Rasail, and after a brief introductory universal history setting the gradual abuse of the earth by mankind, the Ikhwan present an allegorical fable involving an arbitration, much like a modern court case, in which animals submit a complaint about their mistreatment by the sons of Adam to the king of the jinn. Humans and the animals are both summoned before the king, and a jury of philosophers, poets, magicians, and social mendicants to present their case. The human spokesperson begins by asserting, "These cattle, beasts of prey and wild creatures, all animals in fact, are our slaves. We are their masters. Some have rebelled and escaped. Others obey grudgingly and scorn our service." When asked by the king to put forward the proof or evidence that backs up this claim, the human representative responds, Your Majesty, we have both traditional religious arguments and rational proofs for our position. Very well, let's hear them, the king replies. And from here, the drama unfolds, with the animal representatives headed by the mule, very interesting choice of spokesperson that you might also want to discuss in your sections, begin to challenge each and every argument that the humans put forward. From the very beginning then, the question of epistemic certainty, the basis of true knowledge, how do I know that what I know is true, and its relationship to both demonstrative proof, on the one hand, and arguments that come from tradition, from revelation and prophetic authority on the other hand, foregrounds the events that unfold. Interestingly, what transpires is not simply the sequential deployment of the two types of methods in the arguments advanced by the two camps, something like, well, here's my religious argument, and if that doesn't convince you, try this secular rational argument. That's not what happens in your text. What happens instead is a seamless integration of these two forms. Demonstrative reasoning lies at the basis of the speech of both parties to the dispute, just as they both always couch their discourse in references to scripture, to the Quran, and to prophetic sayings, to the hadith. So smoothly is this affected that in the end, the only point of distinction pivots not on whether using scripture is rational or not, but on the nature of the interpretation of the scripture. In other words, the tafsir, and the extent to which it privileges a literal or manifest interpretation, a zahir meaning, or a deeper, more esoteric or hidden reading, something that is batin. Instances of this are tangible in almost all the arguments discussed through the use of the constant refrain, but only those who are well-rooted in knowledge can comprehend. More tellingly, perhaps, is the example in chapter 5, entitled "The Animals Charge Humans with Oppression." This begins with an interesting challenge to the idea of natural slavery, the proposition that some creatures or some beings are essentially and inherently unequal and therefore are natural slaves to others. To debunk the human claim that their mastery over the animals is assured by the animals' dependence on them for food, water, and shelter, the animals begin to deploy a new method of proof, a recurrent chain or silsila of testimonials, one after the other, from all the creatures present. First, the ass, then the ox, then the ram, the elephant, the horse, even the accursed and grotesque pig, who has the most to complain about. This method of deducing evidence from eyewitness accounts or testimonies that extend over time is well established in the fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, and the science of hadith, prophetic narrations, and would come to characterize the very idea of learning in the Islamic tradition. Crucially, this method relies on the importance not of the knowledge itself, whether it's true or not, but on the chain of reliable and trustworthy transmitters or speakers, a point which was also deliberated upon by Al-Ghazali at some length. These issues of method are again woven into discussions of other themes which the Ikhwan take up. For instance, the fable's location in the compendium, coming as it does under the section entitled Physical and Natural Sciences, demonstrates an engagement with Greek, notably Aristotelian, philosophical, zoological ideas that would make their way into the Islamic tradition. At the same time, the fable is a satirical, didactic, literary tool. It is designed to comment on various aspects of the human condition and to admonish or to advise us to a higher moral ideal that is usually rendered in a very simple form. Imagine or remember stories you were perhaps told as children, right? The story of the hare and the tortoise. Anybody know that story? How many of you know the hare and the tortoise? Okay, you are all partaking in tradition by knowing that, okay? So stories like that, the hare and the tortoise or al-ghurab al-nabih, these fables are designed by definition to cross across cultures, right? To cross cultures, to cross historic boundaries, precisely because at the heart of the fable, at the kernel of the fable, is a deeper, enduring message that is seen to be universal. So you will find versions of the hare and the tortoise in almost every culture in the world, right? Because what matters less is the content, but that moral, that kernel of the story, okay? In the case of the animals versus man, the basic message remains loud and clear. Humans must answer for the consequences of their willful, deliberate, and destructive treatment of the earth and its non-human inhabitants. But for the Ikhwan, this is just the starting point. For they are able to weave into their story several other levels of interpretation, involving larger cosmological doctrines about the relationship between creation and the Creator, as asserted in the Quran, where man is enjoined to reflect on the reality of the divine through his ayat, or his signs, so that the ultimate fount, the ultimate source of all knowledge, is the divine, who reveals himself in full glory. Likewise, the ultimate purpose of knowledge is asserted in the fable on two levels. The first is an earthly domain of happiness, harmony, and peace. And we see this played out in the fable's meditation on the nature of the just ruler, personified in part by the figure of the wise, merciful king of the jinn, who regulates through law and presides over a harmonious realm, and whose authority is recognized by both parties to the dispute. It's also present in the disentangling of things such as the meaning of power and submission, what is mastery and bondage, what is tyranny and mercy, truth, falsehood, etc., and whether these are fixed attributes or whether they are instead accidental and ephemeral, and therefore they can be corrected through some kind of program of social, pedagogical, and possibly even political reform. All these points, by the way, all these bullet points are on your fly sheets, so don't worry about it. Okay, the second level that we might think of is the level of individual salvation. So if one level of understanding it is this kind of wider social level, a second level is about the individual's personal salvation. The ultimate end of the Ikhwan soteriological outlook, soteriology is a fancy word for salvation, basically. Outlook being the fulfillment of God's promise in the final return of all souls to their Maker. It is this, in the end, that gives credence to their insistence on friendship and mutual assistance among mankind in order to fulfill the trust given to them by God, the earth and its bounties, and their covenantal duty to know and worship God alone. There is clearly much more that can be said about this fascinating text, but we must now turn quickly to Al-Ghazali, who shares the same three levels of interpretation. The issue of method, right? Truth that is contingent upon both demonstrative proof but also transmitted knowledge or revelation, the question of social ends of knowledge, and finally the question of the individual's concern for salvation in the world to come. Al-Ghazali's Munqidh min al-Dalal is delivered in an autobiographical mode at the supposed behest of a fellow knowledge seeker. It is written in the first person singular, and it recounts the basic steps of the author's intellectual trajectory. The text pivots around a moment of crisis, during which the scholar suffered an attack of severe doubt that led him to question the most basic truths, those derived from tradition, from sensory experience, and from reason alike. To those of you who will take CVSP 203 from the second sequence, you may want to note here the remarkable similarities in this part of the text with René Descartes' later account. His argument then examines and tries to challenge what the author sees as the three major types of truth claims, based on 1, theology, ilm al-kalam, 2, authoritative instruction, ta'aleem, and 3, philosophy, falsafa. The first, theology, he dismisses as being merely defensive. The second, for being unreasonable. And the third, for being incoherent. None of these approaches, in other words, could provide Al-Ghazali with a firm ground for absolute truth. None of them could provide him certainty in knowledge, or could help him get rid of his skepticism. It is important here to remember that Al-Ghazali's point is not to reject the conclusions of these various schools wholesale, but simply to find an anchor for truth in what he describes as a profound and treacherous sea of knowledge. He draws continually on scripture, he embraces theology, of course, and confirms the importance of the authority of an infallible imam. But for him, this imam can only be the prophet precisely because of the primacy he gives to the idea of prophecy, to which he dedicates a passage in your text. Most importantly, he explicitly acknowledges the veracity or the truthfulness of most of the positions of the philosophers. The problem with them being rather, in his view, the dangerous social implications of their teachings for the untrained, gullible reader, who either totally accepts everything that they say, including the non-Islamic elements, or totally rejects everything they say and thus makes Islam, quote unquote, irrational. So neither of these positions will do for Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is only rescued from his skepticism by the light of God, who is indeed the ultimate deliverer or munqidh from error, providing a solid ground for the certainty of truth. The text, therefore, moves to extol a fourth category of knowledge seeker based on mystical experience and the primacy of what Al-Ghazali refers to as al-qalb, the heart. The real, he describes it as, the real nature of man's spirit, which is the seat of his knowledge of God, end quote. The Sufi way of life, Al-Ghazali writes, cannot be learned from simple study, but must be lived holistically. Which explains why Al-Ghazali chose to give up teaching and to live as an aesthetic wanderer for many years. The basic mystical insight conditions his approach to the proof of prophecy and to the availability of truths beyond reason, beyond the rational. Only this allows him to ground his knowledge firmly, allows him to resolve skepticism and to affirm his belief. And indeed, the reorientation of the very principles of everyday life. So when Al-Ghazali does return back to his position in Tus and the normality of his previous existence, he is radically transformed. He says, you can see the quote up there, "In myself I know that even if I went back to the work of disseminating knowledge, yet I did not go back. To go back is to return to the previous state of things. Previously, however, I had been disseminating the knowledge by which worldly success is attained. But now I am calling men to the knowledge whereby worldly success is given up. It is my earnest longing that I may make myself and others better. I do not know whether I shall reach my goal or whether I shall be taken away while short of my object. I believe, however, both by certain faith and by intuition, that there is no power and no might save with God, the high, the mighty, and that I do not move of myself, but I am moved by him. I do not work of myself, but I am used by him." Now again, the echoes with St. Augustine are very palatable in this passage. But so too are the same three levels of concern, same three levels of knowledge. Again, a reflection on the similarities between the texts does not mean that we ignore or efface their differences, but it does help us see, I hope, how tradition works and how Islamic thought as a category can actually make sense. The concern for epistemological certainty that is displayed in the two texts and their mobilization of different methods of reasoning is always pegged in the end to Scripture, to the Quran, and to the modular example of the Prophet. This, then, is what puts the Islamic in Islamic thought. And it is also in light of this imperative that Al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers and theologians before and after him spent so much time examining and elaborating upon the meaning and proofs of prophecy. In other words, if knowledge is a deep and treacherous sea, as Al-Ghazali eloquently describes it, tradition is what anchors the seeker on her journey through this life to the next and delivers her to safety by God's will. The task of reading and interpreting these texts, in their detail, I will of course leave for you to do individually and collectively and hopefully repeatedly throughout your lives. Not only for the purposes of this course, but like all CVSP curriculum, these are texts that ought to remain with you forever. But before I free you, don't start gathering your stuff just yet. Before I free you, I want to draw your attention to a few very broad pointers. So if you've paid attention to nothing in this lecture, pay attention to this part, okay? especially in this day and age. Firstly, both these texts demonstrate magisterially that it is unhelpful to think in terms of a strict division or dichotomy that opposes reason to revelation. The traditional division between al-manqul wal-ma'qul is a much more fruitful and interesting starting point to analyze from. Secondly, it is simply impossible, as a result of the deep and wide intermingling that was described above in relation to tradition in late antiquity, to speak of cultural borrowing, right, or of a particular science, theory, or idea belonging to one culture originally or another. What is more interesting is to precisely trace how ideas live and adapt over time and space. And finally, when it comes to pre-modern knowledge structures, it is deeply problematic to imagine a monolithic or a singular coherent concept of something called religion that is battling it out against another self-evident concept or sphere of philosophy. As we see in the case of Ghazali, even his supposed rejection of philosophy was wittingly or unwittingly philosophical, and in fact, highly original and influential in subsequent philosophies, both Eastern and Western. And I hope that many of you will go on to study higher degrees here at AUB in philosophy and Islamic studies, history, and so on, and we'll think about these questions a little bit more. To conclude, what is perhaps most inspiring and insightful in these authors, and if you're to remember just one thing from this lecture, it is the value of polymathesis. Rather than the increasingly narrow specialization of our current academic tendencies and our disciplines, our arts and our sciences, Al-Ghazali and the Ikhwan too were polymaths. They were scholars who viewed knowledge as an organic and complete whole, and who were accordingly able to discuss and draw on a broad range of topics and subjects to think through the issues of their day as deeply involved citizens of the world. This concern with an all-rounded education did not belong to Muslims alone, but it was a feature of all pre-modern knowledge, full stop, including in Western Europe. What mattered most crucially was the purpose to which knowledge was put, and by extension, its ability to instruct the knower on the meaning and methods of living a good life, its edifying function, in other words. Accordingly, the perfect man of the Ikhwan al-Safa, the man al-Ghazali aspired to be, find echoes in the Renaissance man of European humanism, leaping forward to our own liberal arts here at AUB. Education is also about edification, and this is the very raison d'être of CVSP, and this is why you have to sit here on this fine Monday afternoon and listen to me. Thank you for your attention. By the way, if anyone has questions about the lecture or wants to know more, feel free to email me.